the LGI book, but apparently wasn't to be. Mrs. Fuller, it was not to be. There were other people in there, but this would be okay because some of the kids are a little bit uncomfortable, but that's all right. So let's try to do this. It builds character. Let's try to do this as quickly as possible. Look, the chapters on the test are chapter 17, chapter 18, and part of chapter 19. Now, chapter 17 of your textbook begins with the political situation that transpired in the aftermath of the election of 1840. That's where our conversation will begin. If you remember, in 1840 there was an election, and the election pitted Martin Van Buren, the incumbent president, because Van Buren had been elected in 36, versus a Whig candidate, which was whom? Who do you recall? Who's going to sit there? Who? Yeah. Who do you recall as the Whig candidate? Yes. William Henry Harris. Now, remember this, and there are a couple of questions on the test about this. The Whig Party was a conglomeration of anti-Jacksonites. I mean, clearly the Whigs' kind of core ideological position was similar to the Federalists. They were nationalists. They were the national Republicans. They were the ones that supported the first, the first and second Bank of the United States internal improvements and internal improvements, tariffs, internal improvements in the National Bank, the American system. But they kind of set those things to some extent aside. And basically anyone who hated Jackson for any reason joined in the Whig Party. They were an anti-Jackson party. So there were a faction of Whigs that didn't hold to the nationalist position. Right? And these were typically anti-Jacksonites that were angry at Jackson because of nullification. And I say that because we know this, that Harrison is elected to the presidency, the Whigs take the House, the Whigs take the Senate. And the Whigs are going to take over and hope to implement kind of a Whig ideology. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster are a part of this. They're hoping to see this happen. But Harrison dies 4 weeks after he's inaugurated. And John Tyler takes over as president. And Tyler is basically a Jacksonian Democrat who joined the Whig Party merely as a protest against Jackson and nullification. And so Tyler is going to inhibit the Whig agenda. Clay tries to push a national bank, Tyler vetoes it. They go for higher tariffs, Tyler vetoes it. And so we said that Tyler really ideologically didn't fit with the general Whig philosophy, but he was an anti-Jackson, and this causes a tremendous amount of problems. Now, because of that, we argued that Tyler attempted to distract attention away from the traditional issues. Now, the traditional issues that separated politics at this time were, internal improvements, tariffs, and a national bank. The nationalist agenda versus a states' rights agenda. A limited government agenda. Whig versus Democrat. But because Tyler had alienated his own Whig party, he tries to distract attention to another issue. And that issue is expansion. So what emerges in the early to mid-1840s as the big issue is expansion. And that's what we spend most of our time. Now, if you read your textbook, chapter 17, in a conversation about expansion, they talk about a number of issues. One is something called the Aroostook War. The Aroostook War, which was almost a war between the United States and Britain over the border of Maine. That is something, Jack, when you do your nightly readings tonight, you want to make sure you read about, the Aroostook War. Now, more kind of importantly than that conflict between the British and the United States over the Maine border, is the two other areas where expansion becomes kind of the issue. One is Oregon, right? And we talked about Oregon. The status of Oregon, going into 1841, we said there were about 500 Americans in Oregon. This is a trick question. In 1841, who controlled Oregon? Good,
Both the U.S. and Britain.
That's a good answer. What he said for the viewers at home is both the United States and Britain. They jointly occupied Oregon because they couldn't agree on a border. So because they jointly occupied it, right, they couldn't agree on a border because there weren't enough people there to argue about it. But beginning about 1843, increasing numbers of people went to Oregon. Why? There's a question on test about this. Why did they go to Oregon? Why did Americans migrate along the Oregon Trail? Remember, you know, you kids were all excited about that, the Oregon Trail, right? You know, you did that computer program. Well, why did people go to Oregon? Why didn't they go anywhere? I mean, you know, what was the attraction of Oregon? What do you suspect? We may not have talked about this, but Blake, what do you suspect was the attraction of Oregon? Land. Yes. It's almost like the answer to every question. Land. Right? You know, I mean, there was the Willamette Valley, there was land there, fertile land. News came that this land was available and good, and people migrated for 5 months on the Oregon Trail to get there. And because that was true, with this expansionistic sentiment that was beginning to emerge, what Americans began to demand is all of Oregon. 54-40 or fight. What did that mean? 54-40 or fight. What did 54-40 or fight refer to? Go ahead, Deb. It was the northern border of Oregon. And what that was saying is, we're going to take all of Oregon, or we are going to fight the British over it. So this is one issue that's going to be prominent in the 44 election. The other issue is the annexation of Texas. Now, when we covered the annexation of Texas, and when we put the annexation of Texas in the context of the 44 election, because that's what's happening here. You know, Tyler is the incumbent president. He had ascended to the presidency because of the death of Harrison. He was incongruent with his own party, so he attempts to distract attention to another issue, and that issue is expansion. He doesn't have a difficult time doing that because there's a lot of areas where lots of people in the United States want to expand into. One of them is certainly Oregon. The other area is Texas. Now, when we brought Texas into the conversation, we went back and talked about how Texas became an independent country. Because in 1844, Texas was just that, an independent country. A recognized independent country that wanted to be annexed into the United States. Now, there won't be any questions on the test about that. That was all in previous chapters. I mean, if you looked at previous chapters, there was a discussion about Texas. There was a discussion about how, you know, what happened in Texas, the Americans going there, Stephen Austin, the problems with Mexico, the war for Texas independence, the Alamo, all of those things we talked about in class are discussed outside of chapter 17 in your textbook. In terms of our test, where we pick up with Texas at is going into the election of 44. Texas is an independent country, wanting to be part of the United States, and the expansionists in the United States wanting Texas and all of Oregon. Right? So it was 54-40 or fight, and the annexation of Texas. These were the expansionists. Where expansionists tend to be Democrats or Whigs. Who tended to be more likely to be an expansionist? Democrats or Whigs? Go ahead. Democrats, absolutely. Democrats tended to be more likely to be expansionists. Who would be more likely to want to expand into Texas? Southerners or Northerners? Who would? Southerners, right? Why would Northerners be reluctant? And what people in the North were the least willing and interested in annexing Texas in 44, and even in the aftermath of that? What Northerners were the least interested in Texas's annexation, and why? My goodness, that's an excellent question. Go ahead.
The abolitionists, because they didn't want slavery to expand.
So abolitionists and those who feared the extension of slavery were the most likely to oppose the annexation of Texas. Southern Democrats were the most likely to support it. Democrats in general were the most likely to support expansion. This notion of expansion becomes wrapped up in this concept of manifest destiny. Now, if I were to ask you, any student in this class, let's say Matt here, if I was to ask Matt, define manifest destiny, what would you say?
The belief that America should, like, spread its ideas all the way across America.
I wish every human being could hear that, Matt. It's a brilliant response, right? What Matt said is, it is this notion that America was destined to spread its institutions and its values and its traditions and its economic systems from Atlantic to Pacific. And the idea of manifest destiny is get out of the way. Here comes the United States. Get out of the way, Mexico, here comes the United States. Get out of the way, Britain, here comes the United States. Get out of the way, Native Americans, here comes the United States. And we are going to spread because it is our destiny to do so, because we are an exceptional people. Now, Polk becomes the Democratic. In 44, the Democrats decide to nominate James K. Polk. And Polk is an unashamed expansionist. Polk said, if I'm elected, we're going to annex Texas. If I'm elected, 54-40 or fight, right? An unashamed expansionist. The Whigs in 44 nominate Henry Clay. Henry Clay vacillates on the issue of expansion. And as a result, Clay loses to Polk. Maybe not necessarily as a result. I mean, I'm not sure that that's the reason that Clay lost. I mean, some people speculate that Clay's defeat had a lot to do with the Liberty Party. That was a small, obscure third party that opposed slavery. But Polk wins. And once we elected Polk, we said that Polk had 4 goals. Right? What Polk wanted to do is he wanted to lower tariffs. Once in office, he wanted to lower tariffs, he did that. He wanted an independent treasury, he did that. He wanted to resolve the Oregon question, he did that. How was Oregon resolved? Does anyone besides Belay and myself remember how Oregon was resolved? Go ahead, Belay, tell the kids.
It was resolved, Britain pretty much, we went and said that it was ours, and Britain didn't put up a fight because there was no one looking at it.
Go ahead, Nathan. Yes, we divided it to 49 parallel, which extended the border between the United States and Canada. The Louisiana Purchase was divided into 49, and we just extended it to the Pacific. And so Oregon was divided, and that issue was resolved. The 4th issue was the acquisition of California. Remember, we said that Polk wanted to acquire California. Now, what happened to Texas? Go ahead, Dick Harper.
Tyler managed to annex Texas before he left office.
A very good response. Tyler managed to annex Texas, or to get Congress to annex Texas before he left office. So the issue of the annexation of Texas was kind of off the table. Oh, what did the Mexicans do when we annexed Texas, and why did they do it? Does anyone, Ken, do you remember, what was the Mexican response to America's annexation of Texas? Do you recall?
We went to war time.
Eventually, but initially. I mean, that wasn't their response, was it? Their response to the annexation of Texas. Go ahead, Bobby.
Oh, they withdrew their diplomat.
They withdrew their ambassador. So, in response, why did they, Bobby, dear Bobby, why did they withdraw their ambassador?
They were mad that we annexed Texas.
Yes, okay. Yes, yeah, that's obvious. It continues. Why were they so angry that we annexed Texas, dear Bobby?
They didn't recognize it as an independent country.
That's the key thing. They did not recognize Texas's independence, and so therefore we were annexing part of their country. And so they broke off diplomatic relations. Now, this is the context for Polk wanting California. So Polk basically wants to acquire California, which is a part of Mexico, right? From the Mexicans who are angry with us because we annexed their territory. Now, Camden said something interesting. He said, well, because we annexed Texas, we eventually go to war with Mexico. Well, I mean, that's kind of the subject of discussion. I mean, the subject of discussion is, okay, how is it that we annex Texas and we end up going to war with Mexico? Could we argue that we were attacked by the Mexicans and that's why we went to war with them? Jack, could we argue that?
Yes.
How so?
Because they came onto American soil.
Oh, so Mexicans crossed into American soil and attacked Americans.
Yeah, the Rio.
They crossed the Rio Grande.
Yeah.
Yeah, C would like to respond to that. He has a thought he'd like to share. Let's listen to this. Go ahead, C.
Wasn't that territory disputed?
Oh. So you are saying, C, that there was disputed territory between the United States and Mexico about disputed territory. So Texas was disputed territory in the first place, and then within Texas there was disputed territory over what was Texas. And what did the United States say? The southernmost border of Texas was the Rio Grande. What did Mexico say? The southernmost border was It's how you say it, the Nueces Route. You know, I always thought it was the New Ches, but the Nueces Route, maybe it is. I mean, I don't know. New Ches just sounds so much more Spanish, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know. We should maybe see more Duna up here to pronounce it. So let's go with the New Ches until we hear different. The New Ches River. They argued that was the southern border of Texas. And so this attack by Mexico is in this disputed area. And in fact, there were three issues that Polk wanted to resolve with Mexico. One was he wanted to acquire California for $30 million. The other is he wanted to resolve this border dispute between Texas and Mexico. And the third was that Polk wanted to resolve some claims that America had against Mexico. And remember, he sent Slidell down there to negotiate those three things. But what happened to Slidell? When Slidell was sent to Mexico to discuss the outstanding issues, what did the Mexicans do? Go ahead, George.
The Mexican people sort of rejected him and caused a big deal about having an American coming down there because they were still self-set over Texas, so they turned him away.
And so in response to Slidell being turned away, Polk was considering declaring war on Mexico just on that basis, and that they owed us $3 million. But when the Mexicans attacked the Americans, he calls on Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress agrees to that. And we talked about, the nature of that war. Now, one thing that you won't see on the test is any discussion about any of the battles. I mean, we made mention of Winfield Scott marching troops to Mexico City and Mexico City falling. But what was more important was the eventual peace treaty, the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe. Now, what do you remember as terms of that treaty? Do you remember anything of the terms? What are the big terms of that treaty? Go ahead, Steve.
California would go to the United States in return for a net of $15 million.
Yeah, let's put it this way. California, New Mexico, Arizona, the territory there, goes to the United States in return for basically $18 million. $15 million cash and relieving the $3 million debt. And so, okay, we call this the Mexican Cession. Right? We call this the Mexican Cession. Now, the Mexican Cession, from the very beginning, is controversial. There are people that are opposed to the Mexican. There are people that are opposed to the acquisition of this territory. Why in the world would anybody be opposed, dear back, to acquiring this wonderful territory of California and other places? There were people opposed to the Mexican Cession, acquiring this territory. Why would anybody be opposed? What was the center of the controversy over acquiring California, annexing Texas, the Mexican Cession? What was the big issue back then? Slavery. The fear was that this was an attempt by Southerners to extend slavery and to extend slave power into that territory. Now, that becomes evident with the Wilmot Proviso. Who besides Alex and myself recalls what the Wilmot Proviso was? Go ahead, Alex, tell the kids.
That slavery was the expansion of that new service.
Well, let me just, that's true. Go ahead.
It was attachments to the funding bill that said slavery would be banned in territories acquired from the Mexican Cession.
Yes. What Alex said was true. Alex said were true. That the Wilmot Proviso was a provision on a funding bill that would go to fund the war. It was in 1846, shortly after the war began, that said, look, we will agree to fund the Mexican War if it's agreed that none of the territory acquired from Mexico would slavery be allowed to spread into. And the Wilmot Proviso was proposed by a Northern Democrat and passed the House of Representatives on 2 occasions to the great dismay of Southerners. And the Wilmot Proviso launches this contentious debate, in the country over the extension of slavery. Now, in terms of that debate, there are 3 positions, and there are questions on these 3 positions on the test. The Southern position about the extension of slavery was this, that slavery was a positive good. and that slavery should be allowed to spread where people want it to be able to spread. Right? So that slavery should be permitted and encouraged to spread because it was a positive good. Further, Southerners believed that the United States Congress had no legal authority to ban slavery in the territories. Right? So the territories that were part of the United States were commonly held by all the people in the country. The U.S. Congress had no legal authority to prevent Southerners from taking their property into territories. Now remember today, in 3rd and the 7th, we ended with the court case, right? We ended with a court case. We said, look, Buchanan was elected to the presidency, and when he was inaugurated, he said, there is a court case out there that is going to be a Supreme Court ruling, and it's going to be a ruling on the issue of the extension of slavery into the territories. Well, this is the issue. The question is, are the Southerners right? Does the federal Congress have no authority to regulate slavery in the territories? Or are Northerners right? Because what Northerners said is, look, the Constitution says that Congress is in charge of the territories, right? And being in charge of the territories means they can do what they want. And if they want to ban slavery in the territories, they can and they have. They have banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. They banned slavery with the Missouri Compromise. And if they want to ban slavery with the Wilmot Proviso and prevent it from spreading into the territory, they can and they should, because slavery is a bad thing. Northerners believed on some level that slavery was evil. Now, most Northerners thought that slavery was bad, but it even went beyond that. It wasn't just that slavery was evil. It was that slavery represented a repressive economic system, social system, and a political system that was contrary to the interest of Northerners. So Northerners argued that slavery can be restricted from going into the territories and should be restricted from going into the territories. And central to the Northern position, there are a couple of questions on the test about this, is this idea of free soil ideology. You'll see that referenced on the test, the free soil ideology. What that means is that free soil meant more than just not having slavery there. It meant that free labor was not competing with slave labor. It meant that there was kind of a dynamic, diverse economy that would encourage people to work hard and promote their interests. And that slavery would inhibit all of this. It would inhibit it socially, politically, economically. So this is the dispute. What's going to happen? Should slavery be allowed to, and can it spread into these territories? And if it does, is that going to prevent free labor from going there? Or should slavery be prohibited from spreading into these territories, and does Congress have the authority to do that? And really it's a constitutional question that is going to be addressed with the Dred Scott decision tomorrow. And there are actually questions on the test about the Dred Scott decision, but I'm not going to review them because we're going to talk about them in the first place. We're going to talk about them tomorrow, but that's the question. And then there was a third position, the Northern position, the Southern position, and a third position. Right? What do we do about the spread of slavery? Can Congress prevent slavery from going into the territory? Can Congress not prevent slavery from going into the territory? The third position is Congress shouldn't make the decision. The third position was popular sovereignty. And the people associated with popular sovereignty were Lewis Cass and Stephen A. Douglas. And popular sovereignty suggested that instead of Congress deciding whether slavery would be allowed to spread into the territories, then the people that went there themselves could decide. And the test case for popular sovereignty becomes Kansas, which we were talking about over the past couple of days. Eventually we said that popular sovereignty is applied to Kansas, and you see what happened there in Kansas when they tried to do popular sovereignty. Ideally, the people themselves would say, well, okay, here we are. Do we want to have slavery or don't we? Right? And then they would decide. And that seemed fairly democratic, and it took the issue outside of the government. But the practicality of popular sovereignty was questionable. And one of the people that was instrumental in supporting popular sovereignty was Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass was a Michigan Democrat who gets the nomination for the presidency in '48. The issue of the extension of slavery the Wilmot Proviso and what's implied by the Wilmot Proviso is so contentious that in 48, both the Democratic and Whig Party tried to avoid the issue. The Democrats tried to avoid it by nominating Cass and saying nothing. Right? What are you guys for? Well, we're not going to address the issue of the extension of slavery, but we nominate Lewis Cass, and we know, everybody knows, that Cass is a supporter of popular sovereignty. The Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor, who's a Southern slaveholder, and they say nothing. And the campaign is mostly about, you know, the personalities and the backgrounds of both of these people, and both parties are able to expertly avoid the issue of the extension of slavery. So expertly, the people who are passionate about, you know, preventing the extension of slavery form their own party, the Free Soil Party. Now, to some extent, if you were listening today, and I'm sure you weren't, but if you were listening today, you know, we mentioned the Republican Party, right? We said the Republican Party came out of nowhere in 1848 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Well, the Republican Party on some level is a descendant of the Free Soil Party. You know, the Free Soil Party were the people that said, look, we can't stomach candidates that either own slaves or won't take a position on the extension of slavery. Conscious Whigs, barn-burning Democrats, the Liberty Party joined in the Free Soil Party. Here's a trivia question. Does anyone besides the instructor remember who they nominated in 48? See, look, he's a genius. See, you're a genius. Go ahead.
Martin Van Buren.
Martin Van Buren, the ex-president. Bobby, did you know that?
Yeah.
You did know that. It was Martin Van Buren, the ex-president. And so Van Buren does not win a single state. And remember we said there were 30 states, 15 free, 15 slave. And in this election, Cass wins 50. Cass wins C-A-S-S, wins 15. Taylor wins 15. Cass wins 7 free, 8 slave. Taylor wins 8 slave, 7 free. And, you know, which is an indication that both parties are very much able to deflect this issue, but Taylor wins the election. Now, when Taylor wins the election in 48, he is hoping to keep away from the issue of the extension of slavery. But the issue of the extension of slavery is thrust upon Taylor in the country. Why? What brings it to the forefront? Go ahead. Go ahead, Emily.
The gold rush.
Oh, the gold rush in California. So the gold rush in California might seem unrelated to this, but because of the large influx of people into California and the need in California for a government, because they had nothing, Taylor is forced to address this. Taylor attempts to avoid the issue by asking California to determine the issue of slavery and then seek admission as a state rather than a territory. When California wants to come in, what does California want to come in as? Free or slave? Free. And California seeking to gain admission into the Union as a free state prompts a controversy that almost results in the demise of the Union. Now, the admission of California into the Union as a free state, the first area from the Mexican cession to come in, is not the only issue that is separating the North and the South, right? There's New Mexico and what would be Arizona. There is the issue of escaped fugitive slaves, right? Fugitive slaves escaping in the North, not assisting in the acquisition of fugitive slaves. There is the issue of the Underground Railroad, which takes it even further, right? You know, I mean, we said that, look, Southerners were furious that Northerners were not meeting their constitutional obligation to assist in the return of fugitive slaves. Not only that, Northerners were assisting slaves in escaping by participating in the Underground Railroad. There is a question, several questions about the Underground Railroad. We talked about that. Actually, they talked about it earlier in your text than I talked about it. I talked about the Underground Railroad after we did the Compromise of 1850. In your text, they talk about the Underground. The textbook gets that book that some of the kids read. You've heard of it, right? It's a yellow book. In that book, they talk about the Underground Railroad, the fugitive slave issue prior to that, because it is an issue in what becomes the Compromise of 1850. Oh, what was the name of that famous African-American conductor of the Underground Railroad that we mentioned in passing, but we said might be important? Do you remember, Gina? Harriet Tubman. She was, the famous conductor. There were others as well that were involved in the Underground Railroad. The issue of whether or not slavery should be permitted in Washington, D.C. was an issue. The issue of the border of Texas was an issue. And all of these outstanding issues, Henry Clay decides to package into one compromise, right? One compromise, which becomes known as the Compromise of 1850. And we put the stipulation of the compromise up on the board. We listed that. You should probably take a look. In your textbook, there is again, we keep getting, darn it, don't we keep getting back to that textbook. Son of a gun, Jack. I mean, we just keep going back to that. Just imagine if the kids would, no, don't do that. Get those notes out. Just look at that guy. Right? So anyways, in your textbook, there is that list of the terms of the Compromise of 1850, and we talked about the debate. Boy, was that good. Remember when we talked about the debate, how interesting that was? Look how interested George seems in all of that. Yeah. Most of the kids today. Yes, yes. It's late in the day for the people at home. Anyways, we did talk about that debate. In the debate over the Compromise of 1850, we said that three positions were laid out. And so the three people you should know, and I think there are questions on the test about two of these three people. Clay lays out the compromise. Right? Clay lays out the compromise. Calhoun rejects it. Calhoun's the Southerner. He represents the extreme Southern position. He says, look, we shouldn't take this. This is not enough. There's not enough in it for the South. The South needs some kind of permanent protection, some kind of veto power, right, over the growing power of the North in the national government, right? I mean, the Calhoun position is, look, if we're not protected, the North is going to have their way with us. They're going to abuse our circumstances. They're going to push things on a national level that include the abolition of slavery, and we're going to be done. Now, you can even see this Southern fear in 56, and we were talking about this today. Didn't I tell you today in the election of 56 that Southerners said, if Fremont is elected as the president, we're going to leave? Because Fremont had no obligation to the South for his election. And so Southerners, as long as Democrats were elected to the presidency, and they were obliged to the South for their election, the South felt like, well, we have the president who will appoint Southerners to his cabinet, and will appoint Supreme Court justices, so we have this veto power, right? Eventually, when Republicans are elected, and it looks like they're going to control things for a while, that's when the South is going to want to get out. But Calhoun was saying this compromise is not enough, right? The extreme northern position was articulated by Seward, William H. Seward. And Seward said that the North was giving up too much, that compromising with slavery was a moral evil. And the thing that I want you to associate with Seward is this idea of a higher law. There is a higher law than the Constitution, the higher law of God that should prohibit the extension of slavery. It's an evil, it's wrong. Don't accept the compromise. So Calhoun, the extreme Southern position in the debate, said, don't accept the compromise. The South is not protected enough, right? Seward said to the Northerners, don't accept the compromise. We're giving up too much to the South and too much to slavery. The compromise position was articulated by Webster. And Webster basically said this, take the compromise for the good of the Union. What was the date? This is why, it's not that the dates are important, but what was the date of Webster's speech? Because it's the name of his speech, the 7th of March speech. Right? And so Webster says, do this for the Union. And eventually, we said that no one really did it for the Union. But the compromise passed largely because Stephen A. Douglas divided it into parts and built separate coalitions. And so the result was that all the elements, all 6 elements, and there were actually 8 we put on the board, but they were packaged into 6, were passed, but they were passed separately. Right? So the Compromise of 1850 passes, and when it does, there is a sense of relief in the country, you know. I mean, you know, we talked about that a little bit. We said, well, the compromise passes and Fillmore is the president. Oh, incidentally, how did Fillmore end up being the president? Because I think there's a question about him on the test. How did Fillmore, I mean, because he wasn't the president in the beginning of our conversation, but he ends up being the president. How's that the case? Taylor died. Was that good or bad, incidentally, for the compromise? Taylor dying, see?
It was good because he was sympathetic toward the compromise.
So Fillmore was sympathetic towards the compromise. Taylor was somewhat hostile towards the compromise. So Taylor's untimely death of a tummy ache, right, you know, helps the compromise to get passed. Now, we did go forward and talk about the election of 52. Election of 52, who was elected in 52? Does anybody recall? We should be talking about them all day today. Go ahead, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. But the election of 52 was significant not just for Pierce's election, but what was the big significant thing about the election of 52? The compromise is holding at this point, right? Compromise of 1850, September of 1850, the compromise is holding. You know, the election of 52 was significant because it saw the last what? We were talking about today, yes, the last Whig candidate. Who was, oh, this is a good one, Weissman, this is a good one. Do you remember who that candidate was? You came out of nowhere, Weissman. You came out of nowhere with that one. Winfield Scott is correct. He was the last Whig candidate. And we were talking about that a little bit today. Remember we said, look, you know, it's 52, Pierce is elected, the Whig Party comes apart, right? You know, and what really drove the Whig Party apart was slavery. There were Southern Whigs and there were Northern Whigs, and they couldn't coexist in the same party over the issue of slavery. Northern Whigs were the most adamant opponents of the extension of slavery, most likely to be abolitionists. Northern Whigs would be Charles Sumner, the caning of Sumner that we did today, right? Southern Whigs supported slavery. Southern Whigs abandoned the Whig Party. Some of them went to the Democratic Party. Some of them dabbled in the American Party. None of them dabbled in the Republican Party, right? Because that was a party that was absolutely committed to preventing slavery from spreading. So the Whig Party comes unglued because of slavery. Eventually, the Democratic Party is also going to come unglued with slavery, but not yet, not at this point, right? Because now we're only in 52, and we're moving along nicely. I'll try to hurry this up. Oh, you should read this back in your book, A Discussion About the Annexation of Cuba, which becomes an issue in 52 and 56. Now, we did talk about how the Compromise of 1850, which only holds for 4 years. Compromise of 1850, September, right? September of 50 it passes. It comes unglued with what piece of legislation? We've been saying this for the past 2 years. Go ahead, Drew. It's so nice to have you conscious. Yes, go ahead.
Kansas, Nebraska.
Yes, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's 54, right? 54, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's what ends the Compromise of 1850. However, in the 4-year period where the Compromise of 1850 held, some of the most contentious element of it was that Fugitive Slave Act. Right? You know, the response of Northerners to the Fugitive Slave Act and the response of Southerners to the Fugitive Slave Act. Remember, Southerners were furious that this piece of legislation had to be passed in the first place. They were furious with the Underground Railroad. They were furious with Northern states passing personal liberty laws. Oh, by the way, Taylor, what were those personal liberty laws? Do you recall? Son of a gun. Bob, tell the kids, what are personal liberty laws? Yes. If I have to, I'll call on Matt Davis again. Don't make me do that. I'll do it. Okay, go ahead.
They gave escaped slaves rights.
That's a good explanation. The personal liberty laws gave the escaped slaves. There were state laws now. You know, there were state laws that gave slaves rights. Remember, one of the most disturbing elements of the Fugitive Slave Act was that if you were accused of being a slave, you had no right to defend yourself. You know, in Northerners said, man, this is inherently incorrect. I mean, you have no right to defend yourself. I mean, and so Northern states passed these personal liberty laws that tried to extend rights to fugitive slaves, and the South was furious about this. And they demanded a strict new fugitive slave law where the national government would supersede these state laws. You know, and we talked a little bit about that, the Southerners and Northerners, how Northerners were furious with, you know, dismayed by actually seeing people captured and taken away in chains. And, you know, we said that this really exacerbates the situation between the North and the South, and it sets the stage for Kansas, Nebraska, which we talked about at great length today. Oh, what incidentally, what piece of legislation that had been on the books for 34 years does Kansas, Nebraska explicitly repeal? Go ahead, Greg. The Missouri Compromise, correct. Missouri Compromise. So, Southerners demanded that Douglas's legislation explicitly repeal the Missouri Compromise, opening that territory north of the 3630 line for the first time to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. And remember, Kansas, Nebraska divided Kansas, Nebraska into two parts. And in doing so, you know, kind of suggests that, you know, the southern part of that territory, Kansas, would go to slavery. Now, we did talk about all of the things that we discussed today. You know, Reaper, you were not here today. You were dressed up somewhere today. But while you were dressed up somewhere today, we did talk about the inevitable controversy in Kansas, where free states wanted Kansas to be free, slave states wanted to be slave. Both groups sent their people there. The result were two separate governments that, you know, eventually are going to fight with one another. You know, we talked about, you know, what they call bleeding Kansas, John Brown's raid, you know, that sort of thing. But a couple of other things. What time?
We have to be at bus at 3:40, but Coco wants us there.
All right. Anybody else going to this swimming pool? Okay. That's a superstar on the swimming pool. Yeah, that bus will wait for me to learn. All right, I understand that. Okay. So anyways, a couple of other things and then we'll let you go. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin contributes to this. I should say that the test questions always come in the order that they are addressed in the book. I don't always address them in the order of them. So if you're following your notes from me, sometimes things are different. If you follow your notes from the book that you download, they're going to take things in the order of the book. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was discussed afterwards. You know, we talked about it in a different way. But there'll be questions on who wrote that book, incidentally. You like 3 names. Everybody should have 3 names, shouldn't they? Harriet Beecher Stowe, especially if they're so melodic, you know, they rhyme like that. Harriet Beecher Stowe, they flow like that. Another book that I want you to know is called The Impending Crisis of the South. The Impending Crisis of the South. The Impending Crisis of the South. Now, 2 more things and then I'll let you go, I promise you. 3 more things. The whole Kansas, Nebraska thing, we did it today. And let me, Catherine, just quickly do it now, just real quickly. You know, Kansas, Nebraska, we talked about Douglas's role. We talked about why Douglas wanted to do it. And why did Douglas want to do this? Knowing that this would create, in his words, a hell of a storm. Why did he do it? What was at the center of it? Go see.
He wanted a transcontinental railroad through Chicago. The
Transcontinental Railroad. And we talked about why Northerners were so adamantly opposed to it, because they thought there was this slave conspiracy, that they had territory that they had won for slavery, and now they had lost it. You know, and we also talked about, you know, the battle in Kansas. You know, because Kansas seemed so important to Northerners, the Immigrant Aid Society. What was the purpose of the Immigrant Aid Society, incidentally? Do anybody remember? Yeah, go ahead. Not black people. Well, I mean, anybody. Not necessarily black people, but people who were anti-slavery. So anti-slavery people. Could have been black people. Unlikely that it was, but anti-slavery people. Yeah. And it was mostly New Englanders, which should be something that's familiar with you. Mostly New Englanders, and we talked about Henry Ward Beecher, who supported this. Now, when the Immigrant Aid Society formed, for the purpose of settling anti-slavery people in Kansas, that's what's going to prompt Southerners to take their actions, right? Okay, if the North is going to kind of cheat, and that's what Southerners thought, if the North is going to cheat like this, then we're going to make sure that they can't. And that's when Missourians crossed the border and stuffed the ballot boxes and seemed to fraudulently elect a pro-slavery government, and that's when Northerners become convinced that Southerners are really trying to force slavery down the throats of Kansas and down the throats of the country. So bleeding Kansas and the problems with Kansas are very important. And the problems in Kansas lead to the incident with Charles Sumner and the Bully Brooks. You know, the caning of Sumner further works to kind of expand the controversy between the North and the South. Here is Sumner that gives this inflammatory speech that, you know, in some ways was embarrassing. But Brooks responds with this violence, which confirms to the Northerners that Southerners are barbaric and intent on spreading repression, you know, like slavery to them. And so it further reinforces this idea of conspiracy. And this all set the stage for the election of '56, and we laid out the three candidates in the election of '56. We said we had Fremont, the Republican, first Republican candidate for president. We had Millard Fillmore, the know-nothing. And what were the know-nothings about? What was the center of their political party? Yes. Yes, the know-nothings were a nativist party that were against the immigration of Irish Catholics. And then the Democratic Party nominated Buchanan. Buchanan is going to win because the Democrats are still the only national party, and there is a fear, if Buchanan is not elected and a Republican is elected, that the Union is going to come unraveled. And in '56, the country wasn't ready for that. Now, in '57, the Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision, is going to come. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. We're going to talk about the Compton Constitution tomorrow, the path